An epidemic of mass shootings in the US Postal Service was the source to the phrase going postal, which inspired the cult game Postal. And don't worry, we'll get to the game later. But first, let's start off with the most frequent location for mass shootings in America: the workplace. You see, according to the Violence Project, since 1966, there's been 131 mass public shootings in America. And that's only counting the ones with 4 more fatally shot victims. Out of the 131 mass public shootings, around 30% occurred in the workplace. So why is this video focusing on the US Postal Service? Well, this is a list of postal killings in the rest of the world, and this is a list of postal killings in the United States of America. Between 1983 and 1993, 35 people have been killed in 11 post office shootings. This is what ultimately led to the saying going postal, which is defined as becoming extremely and uncontrollably angry, often to the point of violence, and usually in a workplace environment. The reason behind all these rampages can be found in the Postal Reorganization Act of 1970, which was a law that passed which turned the post office department from a government agency into a government-owned business that we know as the US Postal Service. And before we get into what this meant for the workers, I just have to emphasize that I'm not trying to justify these mass shootings, I'm just trying to explain why it happened. Just because there's no justification for mass shootings, it doesn't mean that there's no explanation. The US Postal Service kept receiving diminished subsidies from the government up until 1982, which meant that they no longer received any money from the government. This led to many changes within the Postal Service because it required efficiency, as they had to fully get by through their own revenue. This meant that the working conditions for the postal workers grew increasingly more terrible. Reports say that postal workers were working at an increasingly stressful pace with impossible demands and an abusive management constantly trying to keep the workforce subdued to a point where you think they start every morning by telling them that work makes you free. The Reorganization Act also meant that postal workers weren't allowed to strike, which essentially led to the kettle boiling over, but instead of water everywhere, it was disgruntled and broken workers snapping left and right. As I mentioned earlier, there were 11 post office shootings between 1983 and 1993. I will not be going into the bloody details of these shootings, so if you want to know more about that, you'll have to do your own research. At 7 a.m. on August 20th in 1986, 44-year-old postal worker Patrick Sherrill walked into the Edmonton post office in Oklahoma and shot his supervisor, Richard Esser Jr. He then proceeded to seek out his other supervisor, Bill Bland, but it turned out that he had slept in that day and wasn't at the office at the time of the shooting. Sherrill then proceeded to go postal and shoot pretty much everywhere before eventually shooting himself, and in the end 15 people died, including the perpetrator, and 6 more were injured. You see, the day prior to the shooting, Patrick Sherrill had got a reprimand from the 2 supervisors, Richard Esser Jr. and Bill Bland. It is believed that it was this reprimand that caused Patrick Sherrill to go postal, possibly at the fear of losing his job or just being at the boiling point. Newspapers reported that Patrick was no saint before the shootings and he had been rumored to have been a peeping Tom and was called Crazy Pat by the local kids. And whether or not that is true, we'll never know, but the fact is that he aced his entrance exam for the US Postal Service and was regarded as a good employee by everyone around him. But according to some sources, the reason Patrick was reprimanded was because the supervisors employed a tactic that had worked so many times before. By reprimanding the workers, and especially the efficient workers, they believed that their performance would only improve even further under the threat of being fired, and that this would motivate other workers to fear for their jobs as well, leading to even more mail being processed through the facility and them getting more money, which eventually would make the upper management happy. What they didn't consider was that this was the last straw for the unstable individual, causing the deadliest workplace shooting of all time. Another notable shooting was the Royal Oak shooting on November 14 in 1991, where 31-year-old Thomas McIlvaine, a former postal worker, shot and killed 4 post workers at the Royal Oak post office, injuring 7 others. The shooting happened as a result of him being fired 1 year prior because he insulted a supervisor. According to his co-workers, Thomas had been a great employee with great performance who was systematically berated and abused by management. They believed that management was trying to set an example, and if they could break Thomas, a former US Marine and professional kickboxer, they could break anyone. Thomas had previously appealed his firing to the union, claiming that it was an abusive workplace, but to no avail. After the Royal Oak shooting, one of Thomas's co-workers, Charlie Withers, wanted to hold the management of Royal Oak and the US Postal Service accountable for the shooting, telling the union about the hostile hostile work environment. The union denied helping Charlie in his pursuit of justice, leaving him helpless to make any sort of change. He eventually got to speak at Congress to lobby for a healthy workplace bill that included anti-bullying in the workplace, so at least some change has come from this since the 1980s. And I just want to reiterate that I'm not excusing these actions by any means. It is a tragedy that so many innocent lives were taken by these individuals. So that was the origins of the phrase going postal. And to turn the video around, the reason I talked about all of this is because it inspired the cult classic game Postal from 1997. Postal is a controversial video game where you control a character called the Postal Dude, who has been evicted from his home. Believing the US Air Force is releasing an airborne agent on his town, he starts killing every military man he can find. In the game, you're being bombarded by a voice in your head that taunts your victims, and Postal Dude's deteriorating mental state is explained by him being stressed, which caused him to go postal. And we see some links here to the game and the actual cases of going postal. However, the game is clearly a bit more extreme on the account of it being a video game. You can only progress in the game by killing a certain amount of NPCs on the map, which can also be achieved even though your character is dead, rewarding the player for creating as much havoc, destruction and mayhem as possible. In 2003, Postal 2 was released, where the developers opted for a first-person view, ditching the isometric top-down view of the first one. The game was released with the tagline, "Remember, it's only as violent as you are." And that is really the truth in this case. You play yet again as the Postal Dude, and the game requires you to do a bunch of mundane tasks which can be completed peacefully or as violent as you want to. You could in theory go through the entire game without killing anyone, and while playing the game, you're constantly being provoked, abused and harassed from everywhere, which brings some interesting links from the game to the real world. Despite Postal 2 being a very violent game, if you make it violent, in a way it tries to put the player in the mental places of the real life mass murderers. It's obviously a dark comedy take on the whole thing, but it's very interesting nonetheless, and it definitely harbors layers of critique of society. In 2011, Postal 3 released, and in 2022 Postal 4 released, but both games received heavy criticism for being terrible games, so I don't really want to spend any time talking about them. A filmatization was also made, but we don't talk about that. All you need to know is that it was directed by Uwe Boll, and I think we're still 10 years away from people worshipping him and his movies as some sort of post-ironic masterpiece. But I do find it interesting how so many people are drawn to violent video games, and several studies have been done on the matter trying to explain what draws us in and what effect it has to us. However, there are no real proof or links that video games make people more violent, or that it has any direct links to any horrific event in the real world. It is interesting nonetheless. And I think the reason why I play violent video games sometimes is that it helps me manage my stress and aggression from real life. And I think the reason why the game series of Postal is so popular is because it's a mix of violent video games being popular in general and the game having such a controversial take on a protagonist. I think people find it interesting to kind of experience it from the perpetrator's point of view and sort of take a look into their mind, sort of in the same way that people listen to true crime podcasts. And while the Postal series are dark comedy games, I still think that a broad fascination there is of people who are able to do things like the Edmonton Post or the Royal Oak shooting had some effect on the game's popularity. At least it inspired the gameplay and the story. If you want to learn more about the term going postal, you should definitely check out the 2010 documentary Murder by Proxy, which goes over the entire history of it. I hope that you enjoyed this video, and I hope that you like this concept, looking at tragedies and how they inspire consumption in one form or another. I find it very interesting and I can't wait to explore more topics. As always, thank you for watching. Consider leaving a like and subscribing, it helps a lot. Bye bye.